Has no information been made available on the rollout of the vaccine to the sector, or is it just insufficient?
I think it's insufficient, Ciara. I mean, I think we all accept that huge efforts are being made to ensure that the vaccination rollout programme progresses smoothly and efficiently, and we're all so anxious to see this coming through. We have, of course, been given, and it's available indeed on the HSE website, we've been given the allocation groups, in other words, the priority list for vaccine allocation, and we've heard the Minister for Health say just today that by the end of February, the first two categories will be covered. That's people who are residents of long-term care facilities and who are over 65, including staff as well, and of course frontline healthcare workers. But it's after that, I suppose, that there's a lack of clarity as to what category in particular childcare workers would fall into. And I think that's come into real focus as we've seen huge concerns around the partial reopening of childcare. So whether or not childcare workers, for example, would qualify as key workers, in which case they'd be in the 6th category group, or whether they would be further down the list in perhaps the 10th or 11th, along with people working in the education sector. This is where there is a lack of clarity. The HSE website doesn't assist, and I know from just contact from talking with people in the early years in childcare sector that there is concern around that issue, and indeed around other issues where there's a lack of clarity, in particular for childcare providers trying to decide who should they prioritise in terms of essential workers. If a child has two parents who are essential workers, it seems the childcare service can be offered to them, but of course it's unclear if one parent is an essential worker and one isn't, and so on, what happens then. So I think it's a very difficult time for childcare providers and staff in particular, and indeed for parents who are also contacting us about their concerns.
And on that particular point, it does seem like an unfair additional mandate to place on childcare providers in order to leave it up to them to decide which child they should or should not provide childcare to during level 5 restrictions. Were I operating a creche, I don't know that I would consider myself qualified to decide who among the parents of the children I care for is an essential worker or who isn't.
Yes, absolutely, Ciara. I think it's a very difficult decision and a very difficult situation for childcare providers to be in. I mean, I'm a parent myself, and I know exactly, what the difficult, how hard creches and childcare providers work. I think that, certainly from what we've seen, there's a real concern that, for example, if you've only two children whose parents are essential workers in your creche, do you then open a whole? Is it in fact worthwhile opening a creche for two children where you might normally have, many multiples of that? So that's the sort of dilemma that childcare providers face. And I think, many parents, even if they do qualify, may not wish to take up to avail of this in any case because of safety concerns. So, while we're all I think glad to note that schools and childcare facilities in themselves have been managed so efficiently and so safely over the last part of last year, there's still huge concerns given the current transmission rates, I think, around for parents and for staff generally about reopening. So I think greater clarity on categories would be helpful. There are some very welcome announcements from Minister Roderick O'Gorman, but I think a good deal that still needs to be clarified. And, I suppose one issue in particular that I know parents again have been in touch about is this issue of refund of fees. If in fact a creche is closing, cannot reopen, and should parents be entitled to a refund of fees? If that is the case, then is the childcare provider entitled to support from the government? And while Minister O'Gorman has asked creches yesterday to refund parents, he hasn't made clear whether funds will be available to the creches and childcare providers.
And if those funds are not forthcoming, I mean, every business needs to maintain itself on a paying basis. If that's at all possible, I would imagine the creches that would find themselves in a position to refund the fees would be as rare as hen's teeth in the absence of support.
This is the reality. So if we look at what Minister Gorman said yesterday, he's asking the providers to pause payment of fees or return fees paid in advance for parents who are not essential workers and therefore can't access services until the end of January. But the problem is that we don't know what the quid pro quo, if you like, or the support will be for the childcare providers that do wish to do so, and that are able to, indeed, as we say, because many will be so strapped that they will be unable to do so. So I think, again, we need greater clarity on what's available. I know the Minister has said, there are general supports, the general supports available for businesses. But I think childcare providers are in a very particular situation because they're effectively, in many cases, providing early years education. They're providing such vital supports for so many parents who are working outside the home, and yet it's a sector that's really received very little state attention. We in Labour have been calling for a long time for the introduction of a universal system of childcare, far greater and more significant state support, and indeed far greater recognition for the highly qualified staff that are working in that sector, and yet who continue to be paid very low wages in many cases.
Labour Senator Ivana Bacik, thank you indeed for joining us. Coming up after the break, I'll be talking to Maynooth University Associate Professor John O'Brennan about occurrences at the US Capitol building overnight.
Kildare Focus with Ciara Plunkett.